terms of the treaty which the U.S. has signed. As Eric pointed out, the United States has already ratified other international treaties that already recognize housing rights, specifically the prohibition against discrimination with regard to access to housing. These include the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. So one thing we must struggle for in the United States is that the United States should ratify without reservation the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights and recognize housing as a human right. If the U.S. does this, it would require the U.S. to take steps to the maximum of all of its available resources with a view to achieving progressively the full realization for all of its citizens of the right to adequate housing. The U.S. would have to ensure that rights in the covenant are enjoyed without discrimination on the basis of race, sex, religion, etc. And the U.S. would be required to report periodically to the UN Committee on ESC Rights on measures that it has adopted and progress made toward realizing these rights for all American citizens. And these committees make useful recommendations and observations which can be very important tools for civil society in the United States to advocate for policy reform and changes in legislation. Finally, if the U.S. were to ratify this covenant, it would become part of the supreme law of the land, and judges in every state would be bound thereby by this covenant. Briefly, I just wanted to spell out what is adequate housing. As I mentioned, General Comment number 4 elaborates upon this by the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. The first is security of tenure. Everyone must have some form of security of tenure, and it is the state's obligation to ensure that its citizens have security of tenure wherever they live, whether that's ownership, whether that's through rental arrangements or lease arrangements or collective ownership arrangements, any number of legal arrangements which can exist, but which provide whoever is living in a particular form of shelter legal protection against any form of forced eviction. So many Americans lack any form of security of tenure, whether they are renting, whether they are subleasing, and this, in fact, is what has led to this, this crisis of foreclosures and evictions. Secondly, a house is not just four walls and a roof. Adequate housing must provide adequate services, materials, and infrastructure where an individual lives. Thirdly, it must be affordable. This is another major aspect of the crisis in the United States, and as Eric pointed out, it's not a problem of housing stock. It's not the physical buildings that are lacking. It is the public policies and the arrangements to make that housing available and to make it affordable for Americans who need housing. Housing must be also habitable. I mean, it must protect the inhabitants from the elements of the cold, the heat. It must be sufficient to meet the needs of the family or individuals living there. In the U.S., often housing is condemned as uninhabitable simply as a ruse for getting people to move out and forcibly evicting them. It also must be accessible. Housing must be accessible to people who have physical handicaps, and the location of housing also determines whether it's adequate. It must be relatively in near proximity to employment opportunities, education opportunities, health facilities, etc. And finally, it must be culturally adequate. Those 7 elements are the elements of what defines adequate in adequate housing. And I would argue that in the United States, each one of these elements of the definition of adequate housing have been violated and continue to be violated in an accelerating basis in the current economic crisis and foreclosure crisis. Thank you for having me today, Eric, and we look forward to the rest of the discussion as well.